This podcast is produced by the Idaho Psychedelic Society, an organization committed to fostering thoughtful dialogue around the emerging field of psychedelics. Views expressed by our guests are their own and do not reflect those of IPS, the podcast host, or its producers. This content is for informational purposes only and is not intended as medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. Psychedelics remain illegal in many states, and listeners are encouraged to comply with local, state, and federal laws. In a field often misunderstood, we are dedicated to fostering awareness, education, and ethical research on the healing potential that psychedelics hold. Please consult your own trusted healthcare providers or legal experts when making any decisions related to psychedelic use.
Welcome to the Idaho Psychedelic Society podcast, where open minds meet transformative conversations. We explore the ever-evolving landscape of psychedelics through science, story, and community. Join us as we talk with researchers, practitioners, explorers, and advocates, each offering insight into the power and potential of the psychedelic movement. Whether you're experienced or just beginning to explore this path, this is a space for curiosity and connection. We're glad you're here.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Kahn, Executive Director of the Idaho Psychedelic Society. I'm so pleased that you're joining us here today for our very first podcast episode. And to kick it off, we've got an amazing guest, Zach Leary, whose name is synonymous with legacy and evolution in the psychedelic space. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Danny O'Malley, who's our Integration Program Director.
Okay, hi, Zach Leary. So good to have you here on the first ever episode of the Idaho Psychedelic Society podcast. I'm the host, Danny O'Malley. And since this is our first ever podcast and our first introduction, I'd like to just take a couple minutes to introduce myself to you and to also our listeners. So I am the Integration Program Director here at the Idaho Psychedelic Society. We're pretty new, just getting things started, and our goal is to host at least a monthly integration circle. So I'm just putting that program together now. I'm also in the current cohort at Intertrek out of Portland for their facilitator training program. Such an amazing school, and I'm so blessed to be part of that. And I have been involved in the psychedelic community in the world for most or pretty much all my adult life for the past 17 years or so. But for about 10 years of my adult life, I've been working in sustainable agriculture and was in service to healing the world that way. And actually, at a holotropic breathwork retreat, I had this profound awakening where I realized that I was serving the world in a good way, but it wasn't exactly my way. And so I decided at that point to go back to school to pursue a degree in psychology, and I'll be starting a master's in mindfulness-based transpersonal counseling from Naropa in January. And we'll be working as a somatic stress reduction coach here pretty soon. So that's a little background on myself. We're so excited to have you here. So grateful for you to be here on our first ever episode. How are you doing today, Zach?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the first episode. That's exciting.
Yeah, of course. So I'm hoping you could introduce yourself just to orient us a little bit into your life story. Obviously, you have quite a legacy behind your name. I'm curious if you could just orient our listeners to what brings you to this moment and how you got. It sounds like you had a bit of a gap in your life where you were not necessarily involved in psychedelic work, and then you dove back in. So could you just orient us a little bit to how you got here?
Yeah, sure. It's a very long story, but I'll try to condense it in some way, shape, or form. So. I think I mean, the very short kind of bumper sticker answer is that I got here because I think it's my dharma, it's my path. Like you said, yes, I do have a rich family legacy behind the name, which, has many sides to it. Many people think, oh, wow, that must have been so amazing. Wow, what was it like? And sure, of course, there are many amazing parts to it. And growing up the way that I did certainly had opportunities and exposure to people and ideas and places and other goings-ons that, most people don't have. And I'm, very cognizant of that. I don't take it for granted. And it was incredible. The downside to it is when you are around somebody who shines that brightly, whose orbit is so strong and so powerful, it's often the case, which is very common amongst celebrity children, is they kind of don't know who they are. You're just so closely associated with that that you're not really sure who you are or what's your purpose, what's your place in all of this. And that was certainly the case for me. I really didn't know who I was. And so when he died, I was left with a huge hole in my heart and my mind and my soul. Just kind of felt like I was aimlessly wandering the planet, just kind of living life by default,
Mhm.
and ran into some problems with substance abuse. But when I got through that, my initial kind of response was to get as far away from that ecosystem and that upbringing as possible. So I went on a completely different road and worked in digital marketing and advertising for a while, pretty successfully at one point, worked on some great projects and great brands. And from the outside kind of external lens of the Western world, many people would see that as success. But for me, about 12 years into a 13-year career in that, I was left spiritually bankrupt and also, again, going back into some personal problems and was really just left wondering, like this can't be all there is, and then I started reintroducing some of my Eastern practices and methods and gravitating towards Ram Dass again and started reintroducing psychedelics. And that really woke up my mind and my heart again, especially after such a long break. I had a 9-year break in using psychedelics personally. And excuse me, when you take that long of a break, it's almost like doing it again for the first time, especially after you go through a lot of big life events. But it woke me up in a profound way. And sooner or later, I kind of found myself here, basically under the umbrella of embracing my own voice and my own point of view and my own perspective, and realizing that, hey, I do have my own voice that is different than my legacy, and my opinions and my theories and my work is different. And so, yeah, here I am. And I spend my time is kind of equally divided between being a facilitator, teaching an online training course, psychedelic studies intensive. I just wrote my book, obviously, which is why I'm here, hosting a
Mhm.
psychedelic. So I keep pretty busy.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Sounds like quite
Yeah.
the process of identity discovery, especially after that digital marketing phase, getting back into the
Yeah.
world um, of psychedelics again. And yeah, you mentioned Your Extraordinary Mind, such an amazing book. I just finished reading it yesterday.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
yeah, I loved it. I loved how it seems very approachable to somebody new to psychedelic medicine, somebody who might not be familiar with this culture at all. Very
Yeah.
approachable, but then at the same time, um, there was a lot in there, a lot of meat for experienced psychonauts who might be looking to deepen their integration or preparation practice or looking for a different medicine. And you do such a good job at explaining the different personalities or relationships that we can have to these medicines. So, um,
Oh, thank
how does how does it feel to have the book out? I know it sounds like it was quite the journey,
you.
and is published now with Sounds True. Sounds
Yeah.
like you guys have a great relationship. So how's this feeling?
Oh, it feels great. And yeah, and what you said is true. I really wrote the book primarily for people who were new or who were mildly curious. I know there is some stuff that can be applicable to the experienced psychonaut, but mostly it was written for everyone else. I didn't want to write a book just for the echo chamber. My goal was to try to welcome new people into the fold with as much information and approachability as possible. Yeah, it feels great to have the book out. Of course, it was a mammoth undertaking. It was really hard to do. Um, but it was a great experience because it was really, when you learned, it was my first book, so it's kind of like learning to do something new, especially in middle age when you learn to do something new. It's hard at first, but then once you kind of find your rhythm and find a method for doing it, um, it comes to life suddenly.
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you said that you thought you'd be able to knock it out in 90 days and at some point you just had to embrace the chop wood carry water just like let's just keep going.
Yeah,
I
no,
love
that
that.
that was not the case. Yeah, and I know I tell the story often, but it was a kind of a strange sequence of events because I wrote the book proposal in 3 days. It was just a download, a complete, just magical download of 30 pages of just a really strong book proposal. And then, like a week later, I sold it. So it went from proposal, from idea to selling it in like 2 weeks. And that kind of tricked me. It fooled me into thinking, wow, this is easy, you know? But for those of you planning to write a book, it is not easy. It takes time and and effort and inspiration.
Of course, of course. Well, so I wanted to launch into a couple things that were primary themes of the book, namely, um, you talk about this idea of cognitive liberty quite a bit in the book,
Hmm.
um, and then how there can be this relationship that might feel like a tension between cognitive liberty and the decriminalization movement. Could you just introduce us to what exactly is cognitive liberty, what that
Mhm.
means for you, and how that's related to decriminalization or the medicalization model of using therapeutic psychedelics?
Well, in this context, I mean, the phrase cognitive liberty can be applied to many different facets of our world and of thinking and of behavior and consciousness. But in this context, excuse me, what I'm referring to under kind of the simplest basic premise is that it means that every human being, every adult has the right to change their consciousness as they see fit. Regardless of policy, laws, how you want to change your consciousness to grow spiritually, to heal, should be completely up to the individual. And the very idea that we outlaw nature is somewhat absurd, I mean, that's kind of an absurd irony. Like you're trying to, outlaw a plant or a fungus or whatever, and just that premise alone is, it's ridiculous, and it really just shows the arrogance of kind of the draconian power structures of the world today. So that's, the basic premise of it. But a lot in the book, I kind of juxtapose it against the medicalization movement often because, while the medicalization movement around psychedelics is really important and very effective and has shown tremendous amount of potential in treating mental health issues, I mean, efficacy rates that are just through the roof and make other methods look like, they're so far behind. And that's really an extraordinary thing. And I have no problem with that at all. In fact, I think it's great. But the problem that I do have with it is if we as a community start just grouping psychedelics into a healing only tool that can only be used under the supervision of XYZ, fill in the blank, of clinicians and therapists and doctors and medical centers and so on and so forth, then I kind of think that we've lost the point. And I don't think that's the end game for psychedelics. I think that's part of the game, part of the end game and part of the goal, but that's certainly not the end game, And so that's really why I chose to kind of go that route in the book and just kind of painting the example that, psychedelic healing, psychedelic assisted therapy is just one of the many applications of using psychedelics and shouldn't be thought of as the only one.
Yeah, I totally love that. Um, yeah, you talk a lot about the war on drugs and how
Yeah.
the roots of the war on drugs were really pretty profoundly racist, and we're still dealing with
Yeah.
the fallout of this war on drugs. And it seems like that specifically really has forced us to pigeonhole the use of psychedelics into something that has research that backs it, or
Yeah.
something other than just the expanse of consciousness.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And we can't forget the reason I look at it in one kind of macro perspective is because the outlawing of psychedelics was another iteration of the war on drugs. And so I while of course psychedelics are different than, other illicit recreational drugs. Of course they are. I'm not so naive to say that they're not, but they did get wrapped up into that larger conversation. And if you look at every iteration of the war on drugs, it's always a war against the people we don't like, or when I mean the government, it's always a war against the people the government doesn't like. And when Nixon saw that most of the Vietnam protesters, most civil rights fighters and marchers and protesters and all the activists of the 60s were using cannabis and LSD. That is why he made them illegal. And, John Ehrlichman even says as much. He said so decades later in a great documentary, he admitted it. And that's just one example of, every kind of drug that's been outlawed. It always goes back to some form of criminalization against the people, not the substance. And then look at, the greatest drug problems in America. I mean, look at the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis was based initially off of legal prescriptions that people were abusing. So, all of these kind of weird glitches in the matrix kind of paint a really strong example of why that's an important area to still focus on. While I support, psychedelic healing and the rollout of legal psychedelic assisted therapy, and I think that's fantastic, but I think we can't lose an eye on kind of the bigger picture that there are still millions of Americans, mostly of BIPOC orientation, who are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses.
Yeah, so tragic and such a shame. So
Yeah.
where do
And
we?
such a failure too.
Yeah,
I mean, the war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure. And I think most people in America, no matter what side of the fence you're on, can agree with that.
yeah, for sure. I think you mentioned that in the book that a significant percentage of the population now recognizes that the war on drugs has been a failure. So where do we go from here? How do we hold these two ideas? Where do we? I love in the book how you say that you contradict yourself and that you yourself are a work in progress, and I love that because I find myself doing the same thing, like pulled in one direction or the other, and then at the end of the day, kind of feeling grateful that I'm not the one writing the legislation because
Hmm.
it's a really tricky, paradoxical place, which, paradox is a fun place to live in, but where do we go from here? What do you see as the way to bridge these two worlds?
Yeah, and you're right. I'm glad that you pointed that out before I had to say it. I contradict myself all the time and even kind of revel in the absurdity of my own predicament and hypocrisy around the whole thing because on one hand, I'm not so sure that, the local head shop or, cannabis shop should be selling, vials of pure LSD with 1,000 hits in them. I don't know if that's the answer. So yeah, I often get confused about the whole thing. However, I will fall back on a good kind of example of how cannabis rolled out, especially in California. For the first couple decades, California cannabis use was relegated to getting a medical card. And the first time that it was up on the ballot for recreational use, it failed. And it seemed that people kind of needed more time to get comfortable with the effectiveness of cannabis as a medical relief agent tool, medicine. And then by the time it came around again on the ballot, then it passed. So I think it could possibly be the same way with psychedelics as we're seeing in Oregon and Colorado. I mean, granted, they are decriminalized there, but when we see them used safely and wisely in kind of more kind of controlled circumstances, I think the general public at large can get comfortable with the idea that, hey, for the most part, especially when we're talking about like things like mushrooms, they're very safe. I mean, they're implicitly safe. And, and also too, I have to say, like, I think kind of not to use a business terminology, but like the market cap for the amount of people who will do psychedelics if they were legal, I don't think it's that high. It's not like cannabis, which is a regular consumption agent. People who buy legal cannabis use it frequently. It's not the case with mushrooms, or whatever, any plant medicine. You're not using it often. So I think once kind of the dust settles, we'll see that, oh, okay, it's probably not as a big a deal as we think. So yeah, where do we go from here? I think looking at again like places like Oregon and Colorado and Denver decriminalized psychedelics first, and then plant medicines rather in Oakland, and looking at these municipalities and states that are kind of testing the waters. I think that's probably the first step.
Yeah, learning from their experiences.
Yeah,
Yeah. Being in Idaho, Idaho's a very conservative area.
got it.
We also have a strong libertarian population, and so there is this affinity for ideas of being able to do what you want. But then I think still a large part of our population is isn't totally familiar with the psychedelic science and hasn't maybe read the peer-reviewed journal articles or is not up and up on the news of Colorado and Oregon. And so it
Sure.
seems from our perspective here that it's especially important to have a bit of a slower rollout, more gradual process of introducing the fact that psilocybin is quite safe and that these medicines are not, you know, the fear-based picture of somebody freaking out at a festival that you might think, although that's
Right.
obviously part of it. But um,
And I also too, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but like I also, I have to think like in Idaho, and it's not dissimilar to Texas where I live. It's like, a lot of, people who are not part of our community who are on the other side of the fence, their initial reaction to psychedelics is based off of decades of disinformation, right? Decades of fear-based propaganda that was very effective at planting seeds in our culture and demonizing these compounds, right? That's usually the first response. And I think a large part of the work that we do, and I mean, you guys too, and me, and you guys and local psychedelic societies, is to course correct so much of this disinformation, and that's decades worth of it, and it takes a long time to do that. And we see it being kind of effective in some circles. I think the veterans who have used psychedelics to treat PTSD, that's been incredibly effective at kind of changing the minds of people whose minds need a changing, not like me or you who were already on the bus. So, there's many little facets of that conversation, and it's pretty complicated and requires a great amount of patience. This is not going to happen overnight.
yeah, definitely. So you're based in Austin, is that right?
Yeah, I'm based in Austin. I've been here 5 years. I'm from Los
Okay.
Angeles originally. Yeah.
Okay. So I just saw, I'm curious, you brought up cannabis and the perception around cannabis, and then how would you say cannabis and psychedelics are different as far as rolling them out and changing public perceptions? I've noticed that oftentimes in the psychedelic movement, there's a bit of a distance from cannabis.
Hmm.
Even in Texas, I just saw that there's tons of research now going into ibogaine, but then almost at the same time, they're trying to make it illegal for any THC to be in any products, which would kind of upset a lot of the hemp industry there. So, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, it was very unfortunate here in Texas. While this Ibogaine bill passed, the Farm Bill was also repealed. Um, and the Farm Bill in Texas, had this tremendous loophole in it for THCA extraction. I'm not a cannabis user myself, but from what I understand, it's pretty close, pretty much the same thing. And you are seeing all of these unregulated products all over the place with this THCA thing in the form of gummies and flour and vape pens and so on and so forth. And that also creates a problem because a lot of these products out there were completely unregulated, just garbage, really terrible, um, you know, compounds. Some of them were really good, but it invites in bad actors as well, which we're also seeing in like the psilocybin space as well. So, yeah, I mean, again, I think the big difference is, with cannabis, cannabis from, I think most people who use it, they use it regularly. Um, and again, psychedelics are not that. They're not something, with the exception of microdosing, maybe. But other than that, we're not talking about, nobody's doing macrodoses of psychedelics 5 days a week. So that's the big difference for sure. Um, and also, the other primary difference is experiential. I mean, psychedelics require a great amount of planning and fortitude and preparation, and really a lot of care and wisdom that goes into their use, whereas cannabis can still be used, socially and a little bit more casually. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of that to consider for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction. So
Yeah.
I want to pivot now to talking about another theme that comes up a lot in the book
Mm.
and in most psychedelic circles that you hear is these idea of harm reduction, trauma-informed care, really understanding what you're getting yourself into and knowing how to prepare properly, understanding set and setting. And I love that you added sustainability, the third S.
Mhm.
Um, can you speak to this a little bit? How can somebody who might be new to the psychedelic world know that they might be ready for a journey, how to get properly prepared for one. Um, yeah, can you orient us to this a little bit?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've seen in the last decade or so, especially as the rise of psychedelics are starting to really happen, um, and they've gotten very popular, especially in, mainstream circles and mainstream news and things like that. Um, One tendency I notice with a lot of people is they're rushing into it, especially around mental health issues. They read some headline or see some top line kind of result of some peer-reviewed study and think that this is a magic pill. Oh, wow, MDMA treats 72% success rate for PTSD. Great, let me do it. And they just rush into it. And, they're ignoring a lot of kind of the, bottom tier ephemera that surrounds it. Each person that participated in those studies went through a great amount of preparation and screening and therapeutic support with a therapist and various psychedelic experts, and really getting educated on what the process is about. So, for people who are considering this, one great um, uh, bit of success from the modern psychedelic movement is there's so much information out there. There are so many great books and websites and podcasts and speakers that can really help get you educated on what going into this is about. Unlike the 60s, by the way, which was, there were maybe a couple books on psychedelic use when LSD first hit the population, and a lot of people were just shooting in the dark. They didn't really have a roadmap. But today we do. So that's where I would start, is really educating yourself on all the pros, all the cons, all the possible success rates and outcomes and stories, as well as the risks. And if you're new to it, finding people, especially in groups like yours and local psychedelic societies. Almost every major city in America has some psychedelic society, and if you're new, go find the others, meet them, meet the people, talk about it, talk about their experience, and know what it is that you're getting into. And then find somebody to work with, you know. So, I mean, that's where I would start.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, um, almost any bad experience that you hear about, usually it seems like it can be traced to improper preparation, improper understanding of set and setting. I know personally that's true for me.
Yeah.
Um, t how did you come to the third S of sustainability, of set, setting, and sustainability, and what does that exactly mean?
Yeah, well, I actually came up with it with my partner. I was kind of riffing on the idea and the philosophy of it, kind of had all of that figured out, and then we were just talking about it. And then she kind of blurted out the word sustainability, and I was like, oh wow, that's great. So it was kind of like this collaboration with her on that. Um, but like the original, philosophy, and which is still something I'm very passionate about, is, if you are going into a journey, you know, I hope that everyone's goal is to extract as much juice out of every journey as possible, to make every journey as useful, expansive, and pragmatic as possible, you know. And that really, in the simplest terms, that's what we call integration today. And there are so many methodologies for successful integration, but really using your time in the space and what happens afterwards to see how this journey changed your life, and what you can do. Integration is about turning insight into action and taking that action and, applying it to your life rather than falling back on the trap of chasing peak experience. Oh God, if I go back in just one more time, I'm going to get the answers. I'm going to get the answers. And sometimes repeatability is useful. Of course it is. But for the most part, I think, it's so great to see that there are so many people taking integration very seriously. And that's what I mean about sustainability. It's like, every time that you go through a big journey, most likely some form of a transformation, whether it's cognitive, spiritual, energetic, or somatic, will happen to you. And it's up to you to take that information and apply it to your life. Yeah. So that's kind of, yeah, that's the basics on sustainability.
I love it. Yeah. Yeah. And as we're developing our integration program here, I really appreciate that. And, it's easy as somebody who's new to the medicine to think that you will have that transformative experience and then boom, you're done. And it's so important to bring like everything you learned from that experience and how do you integrate that into your life afterwards? Because as you say in the book, and as so many thought leaders in the psychedelic movement are very keen on emphasizing, you really the work comes after the session. What do you do with the lessons you learn?
Absolutely, that's so true. And, I would also, something else I would add to it too, which is, part of how I ended up here was in doing my research for the book, I was going back and looking at a lot of the original kind of, 60s kind of, now legendary books on psychedelics, including ones written by my dad and Ram Dass. And there's not a single mention of integration, you know? And it was so strange to me to kind of realize that. And, they're not around to ask why, that was kind of left out of the whole equation back then. But I found it kind of striking. And so, like, yeah, like you said, so many of our great thought leaders today are putting emphasis on, well, the work really comes from, comes afterwards, any, almost anybody can, take a huge amount of mushrooms and dance around and listen to music and just sit there and have an experience. But, when you really put the rubber to the road, that comes what you do with it afterwards. And so, yeah, I felt, if there's anybody around who could add to the set and setting paradigm, it was me because, my father and my mentor wrote it, came up with it. So I thought, hey, why not?
Yeah, you're in such a unique space to add to the discussion. And so when you had this awakening or reawaken, I would say, to get back into the psychedelic world, can you describe a little bit of where you were at and if you're comfortable talking a little bit about your struggle with addiction?
Hmm.
Because, addiction and PTSD seem like the two places to turn to for uh, prime efficacy for using these medicines to heal. Um, are you comfortable talking a little bit about your story with that and how you transferred out of that phase?
Sure, I can in some ways for sure. I mean, the whole kind of roller coaster ride is a whole separate podcast. I've been in recovery since 1998, but I have relapsed more than once. And my substance abuse has taken me to, the darkest depths of humanity, jails and institutions, homelessness. I lived on Skid Row in Los Angeles for a couple months, completely destitute and living on the streets. And those are, really, really demoralizing places to find yourself in. Um, and it's really through the grace of a lot of friends and through the grace, I think, of my spiritual practice and my spiritual connection that initially lifted me out of it and helped me kind of get a moment of clarity to seek help. But psychedelics really helped a lot in helping me to deal with the trauma that I was running from. Addiction to me was, you know, it wasn't ever a death wish or anything like that. It was just a way. It's, most people who use drugs in an addictive sense, they think it's the solution. It's not the problem. You think it's the solution. And it is the kind of misguided solution to numb your pain. And it does that, it keeps you in kind of emotional purgatory. You're never up, you're never down, you're just kind of in neutral. Even when things are really bad and falling apart around you, you still are kind of in neutral. And psychedelics really helped me to kind of isolate, where the origin stories and the real pain points of my trauma lies and how I could reconcile with that, build a better life. It's hard work though. It's really hard work, for anybody who's in that predicament, not just with addiction, but for any severe trauma. And Um, I think it's an important thing to remember is that you go into the psychedelic space, it's not all unicorns and fairies. It can be very dark. It can be very challenging, very confrontational, and really getting in touch with the shadow sides of your incarnation is not for the faint-hearted. It takes an incredible amount of perseverance and resilience. and compassion with yourself to want to take a look at that. So yeah, I mean that's the basics of it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that comes up so often for people that I've spoken with about psychedelics who have traumatic experiences that they want to process, but are maybe afraid to encounter that in an altered state, or maybe don't know
Yeah.
what might come up.
Well, that's the thing though. I mean, right? I mean, with, I know the work that you do personally, it's like, how do we inform people that, hey, most likely, if you are afraid of confronting something, most likely, I'm sorry to tell you, it will come up. You are going to get in touch with it. And how do we let them know that that will end up being a constructive experience to have, and that it's going to be okay in the end. It can be a tough thing to communicate because I have found with most psychedelics, MDMA is a little bit different, but with most entheogens, you can't run.
Yeah, as you say, you're staring right there in that cosmic mirror.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's not
yeah,
going
for
to
sure.
tell you the truth.
Yeah, and again, that brings up the importance of preparation and really knowing that you're in a safe and held place, knowing that you trust the person you're working with. And it also brings up the idea of which you talk about in the book quite a bit, is having a spiritual practice or something to lean on to help you process this before, but primarily after the work is done as part of an integration, something to lean on that gives you great peace in you're a bhakti yoga practitioner, is that correct?
Yeah, and that's what works for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I come from the Ram Dass school lineage and spent a lot of time in India and studying and just being there. Um, But, that's just my practice. But I really encourage, everyone who wants to use psychedelics successfully, that having some sort of contemplative practice in your tool belt is an incredibly powerful and almost necessary tool to have, whether it's traditional meditation, breath work, float tanks, whatever it is, praying, going to church, singing kirtan, finding a sangha, whatever it is for you, just grab onto that. Because not only does it really foster and nurture your spiritual heart and connection to the spiritual side, and but it also, from a scientific standpoint, it also activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is a very necessary kind of state to be in for successful psychedelic work. So I think there are two sides to it.
Mhm. Yeah, say more about that. Maintaining a healthy nervous system in psychedelic work and the process of attunement. How important do you think that is between the person sitting and the facilitator sitting for them?
Oh, incredibly important. So, so, so important, I mean, good facilitators will recognize that, especially going into the journey, the work that you're doing before in preparation, that may be sort of cognitive in nature and kind of looks a little bit like traditional therapy. But when you're leading up to the journey itself, I think a good facilitator realizes that the Voyager should be in a state of receptivity and of awareness and of calmness and of breath awareness and of just kind of energetic equanimity, and that, as my teacher Ram Dass would say, the experience itself is not there for you to try to figure it all out. It's there for you to just observe and make friends with whatever's coming up. Um, so when you shut off your thinking mind and open up your heart, there's a great amount of distance between your thinking mind and your heart mind, and that takes work. And I think good facilitators can really tune into that and really see when the Voyager's in their head and overthinking something, or kind of taking their fears and just spiraling around that, and can help get them into a place of just kind of slowing everything down. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. So, can you speak to your personal philosophy and approach to facilitation? I know you work with the Service Center in Jamaica. Um,
Mhm.
the approach in Oregon and a lot of the schools in Colorado are primarily non-directive. Um, what is your relationship with non-directive versus directive, and how to be in relationship with somebody in a session?
Well, it does have a lot to do with what the person's coming in for, you know. So for the most part, I am pretty non-directive and do fall back on the inner healer paradigm for sure. But there are definitely opportunities and situations and circumstances where a little bit of directiveness is appropriate. But again, that depends on why the person's coming in, you know, and what's happening to them during the experience itself. Um, so I want to, qualify that. For the most part, I believe that the experience itself is about turning inward and not about being in 6 hours of talk therapy. You know, that said, whatever is coming up for the Voyager during the experience, if stuff is coming out in the form of words and they need kind of a sounding board or a mirror to reflect back on and to help kind of steer them back on track, there are moments where directiveness is appropriate. I'm not saying that. Um, but for the most part, I do try to get people to go inward and just to explore their inner worlds and their inner consciousness during the session itself. Afterwards, during integration, hey, then we can really bounce ideas back and forth and get into a different relationship. But during the journey itself, I tend to lean towards that. Um, and, so many others, I really focus on the three-stage process: preparation, the journey, and integration itself. It's always kind of a package deal, if you will. I think my book does a good job at explaining that. But during my sessions, I do bring in my spiritual lineage as well, especially during the ceremonial part and the opening ceremony. I do a kind of a bhakti yoga infused puja, which is just my offering. Um, I do believe that even in the most severe mental health applications of psychedelics, that it can still be ceremonial, and still feel like ritualistic. And that, so I do invite that in as well. And I do think it's really important. Yeah, I just don't think it should just be in sterile white rooms with, no love or ceremony involved, you know.
Yeah, definitely. It almost feels like you're leaving something out if you're leaving that out. And I love how in the book you say, I don't know how somebody on LSD could sit through an MRI sitting in that chamber for so long.
That still boggles my mind. Uh, yeah, I keep meaning to ask Robin Carhart Harris that the answer to that, because to me, I just have no idea how they did it, but they did.
Yeah, for sure. So your teacher is Ram Dass or was Ram Dass. Can you
Yeah.
in the book you say that you wanted to rekindle a relationship with spirituality, and at some point you're like, oh, I know Ram Dass. Like I'm gonna reach out and go visit him. Um, can you speak to him as your teacher and the influence he's had on your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I was growing up, he was around all the time. And, when I was a kid and a teenager, honestly, like anytime he was around, he terrified me. Um, that for those of you who are familiar with Ram Dass, that look that he had in his eyes and that constant beam of love and just that sense of being tuned into something else. When you're a teenager or a child, that's a very scary thing to be around. You're like, oh my God, what is this guy? Like, is this an act? Is this what's happening here? It was just so destabilizing because it really highlighted where I was uncomfortable, that I couldn't just be in stillness and just be with somebody without having to fill it up with words.
Mhm.
Um, but when I was a young man, his work influenced me tremendously. Be Here Now and many of his other books as well and lectures. And they influenced me tremendously, but I didn't really have the discipline for a spiritual practice. And then in my early 30s, I started kind of developing a spiritual practice of my own, meditation, yoga. And then, yeah, like you said, when I was kind of going through this kind of turmoil in my career, I was like, wow, uh, why don't I go visit Ram Dass? Like, it's been a few years since I've seen him, since he moved to Maui. Take advantage of that. So me and a friend did, and there was something about that visit that really changed the whole fabric of my life and my relationship with him. It was the first time he appeared as a teacher to me. That was November of 2008. And yeah, it was incredibly magical. It really it was a beautiful thing. And yeah, and he was just for those years, in the last years of his life, he was so instrumental in helping me to grow and get closer to this work as well.
Mm, that's so beautiful, and kind of funny that you felt so intimidated by him and felt that
Yeah,
you that, like you couldn't be here now in front of him, or it was almost too intense.
absolutely.
So, growing up, was there a rotating like thought leaders? Was that super present in your house, or what was that like growing up?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my goodness, yeah. There were always just oh my God, yeah, so many great people and thought leaders and thinkers and musicians and artists and filmmakers around. And um, my parents were big on, they were pretty social people, so there were lots of gatherings and kind of Sunday salon things. And yeah, I mean, what a tremendous gift. And I wish I knew then what I knew now to really take more advantage of it, but yeah, I remember so many of those thought leaders so well and their presence.
Did you ever encounter Alan Watts?
No, no, he died before well, like the year I was born.
Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't know when he died. I guess he's one of my
Yeah, yeah.
absolute favorites.
Oh, me too. Oh my gosh, I grew up listening to Alan Watts on KPFK public radio. They played him every Sunday night. And followed by Joe Frank. And God, I grew up listening to him, and me and my friends would record them and share them, and it was so great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, can you speak to a little bit of? Um, I'm so curious. I'm always curious about people who are experienced psychonauts, about sort of their cosmology, about what is happening in a psychedelic headspace. I know, and there's a lot of different forms of thought, going from an indigenous shamanic perspective, where you are engaging in like an ontologically real realm, and you have to be very
Mm.
discerning and careful about the realm, because there are energies around that you have to understand what you're engaging with. And then the therapeutic model is much more trust the medicine. The medicine will give you what you need and no more. Um, like if you see a door, go through it, kind of thing. So, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, though, and I think that the therapeutic model too also does borrow from the shamanic model a little bit in that sense. But I think we need to take a step back and sort of just ask ourselves, well, first understanding that for the most part, not even for the most part, entirely, nature is pretty evolved. Nature is, kind of perfect in its cycle of evolution, life, death, growth. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, why? Why do these compounds exist? Why are they here in the first place? Um, what is their place in the evolutionary cycle? They're here for a reason. It's not just happenstance that if you take this specific herb or this specific fungus or this specific vine, that something's going to happen to you. I don't think that is just a random set of occurrences. There's some evolutionary, cosmic reason why they're here in the first place. And I truly believe that, and the human relationship with psychedelic plants goes back as far as written history goes. I mean, look at the Tassili cave paintings that are 10,000 years old in Algeria, with the mushroom iconography. And so, it goes back so far. So, our relationship with that realm, goes back much further than we think and probably influences corner of our culture and our belief systems much more than we probably think. Um, there's some written history doesn't support that, but a lot of it does. But I would definitely say that it does, so that's kind of how I would answer the question is just remembering that these things are here for a reason. And that reason is might be up to the individual, but I think it is to help us, both of the things that you said, really, to explore other dimensions and perhaps energetic frameworks and entities and kind of, you know, little parallels into other dimensions and piercing the veil of reality, as well as there to teach us and heal us and to show us doors that our waking state of consciousness cannot walk through, cannot present to us. And that's okay. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that our waking state of consciousness is limited. You know, it's that, you know, the human capacity in our normal shared reality is limited to a certain kind of framework of reality. But if you ingest this, it will expand that. And temporarily, of course, but you know, when you walk through those doors and commune in those realms, I think there's a much bigger reason. So
Mm,
what it happens, I mean, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of science to support why psychedelics work on the brain, what parts of the brain they work on. And that's all been fascinating. Everything from, you know, the serotonin relationship to the hemispheric expansion and unity of our brain. I mean, that's all fascinating and it's really useful information. But why it produces the experiences that it does, I don't think we'll ever truly know. And I don't think we
mhm.
need to. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to ponder, but there's also a little bit of mystery left in that too.
Right. Yeah, I love just being okay with the mystery. And I feel
Yeah.
like when I was younger, I always tried to I really identified with the idea of like the seeker, like there's something to figure out here. I'm gonna figure these realms out, you know. And that oftentimes led me into places of further confusion. And once I was able to embody the witness mentality, this is all okay. It's okay to be in the mystery. Um, I love this. Do you ever listen to Danit, the artist Danit?
I love
She
it.
has this, yeah, she's beautiful music. She says, it's dangerous to be the seeker. Seeking makes the human heart blind. And the first time I heard that, I was like, oh, but I love seeking, you know? And then she's like, just be okay with the mystery and the unique mystery that each medicine can provide to you is also fun and
But
interesting.
yeah, I agree with that. But on the same hand, like the same side of the coin, like seeking the mystery, I think is okay. You know, it's like that's what it means to be kind of a seeker. It's kind of like I wrote this in my book, like the Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. You know, that is about seeking, and it's about, you know, entering the cave that you fear to enter, you know, and seeking for that mystery. It doesn't mean that you're going to figure it out, but embracing the unknown and seeing what that adventure manifests for you is a good way of life.
Yeah, definitely. Fun places to play.
Yeah.
So, looking to your future, what is in your what's in the future for you? What are you working on? I know you're working on a psychedelic studies intensive program.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that entails?
Yeah, I can. And it starts again on July 2nd for any of your listeners that are interested. It's an 8-week course, 2 classes a week. Well, one week has 3 classes, but 2 hours each class, 8 weeks, 8 different modules, all live, not pre-recorded content. Um, And, you know, loosely, it originally started out as kind of a framework to help make people better facilitators. And while that still is the objective, a lot of people started taking the course who were just interested in learning more about psychedelics. So I, excuse me, I changed some of the curriculum to be a little bit more welcoming to everyone. So we study a lot of psychedelic history, um, pharmacology, taxonomy, and then basic, you know, fundamentals around facilitation, working with others, dosage protocols. We studied a lot of peer review studies and really look at the impact that they've had on science and mental health. Um, inviting in mysticism and spirituality and wisdom and ritual into the practice of psychedelics and how a framework for that might exist. So it's kind of a crash course, and there's a lot of information in the 8 weeks. But yeah.
Yeah, cool. Sounds very comprehensive. So what's the best way for people to sign up for that?
Mm. If you go to zachleary.net, you can sign up for that. And if you do go, try to visit it on the laptop. I see a lot of people visit on their mobile phones, and there's too much information to read on your phone. It's pretty exhausting. So try to visit on a laptop and just take in the information.
Okay, awesome. Well, Zach Leary, thank you so much for being with us on our inaugural podcast episode for the Idaho Psychedelic Society. We're so happy to have you. So blessed to have met you. Congratulations on your book, Your Extraordinary Mind. Just came out last month. It's been out for about a month now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me in the first episode. I'm honored.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Ram Ram.
Ram Ram.
Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Zach Leary. Want to learn more or get involved? Visit idahopsychedelicsociety.org. Stay curious and stay connected. We'll see you next time.